All right, can we start the clock? Yes, final countdown. My name is Mike Kivikoski. You can find me on Twitter at @mkivikoski. My last name is fairly hard to spell, so if you hashtag with Cascadia16, I'll find it and we can talk. There's a lot of stuff that I'm going to be talking about today, so if you want to follow along at home, bit.ly/pseudo-slides, and my slides are up on Speaker Deck. Feel free to star them. I'd appreciate that. So before we begin, just a quick warning, my examples in here are for demo purposes, may not be the best use cases, and you want to think about how you use a lot of the pseudo stuff in your application for maintainability, performance, and your specificity, because it could become very dangerous, not dangerous, but like very large and then a pain. So classes versus elements. So pseudo-class is used to define a specific condition or state of an element, and a pseudo-element is used to style specific parts of an element. They used to just be single colons, but in CSS3, the introduction of elements with 2 colons was created so that we could have some visual distinction. Elements that existed before, so like your after and your before, can also be used with just a single colon, and that's fine. IE8 only recognizes single colons. Any new elements created are only going to work with the double colon. So just a fun fact going into the future. In terms of their specificity, a class or a selector has the same as a regular CSS class, which is 1, 0, or 10, and an element has the same as an HTML element, which is just 1. So let's begin. Let's start with some easy stuff. Pretty much, you're going to see something in here that you already know, and hopefully there'll be some few things in here that you don't know, and so you can use that going forward. So link, styles applied on links that a user has not visited. So this is typically your default anchors, but the fact that a user has not visited is important. Visited is styles applied on links that a user has visited. And for privacy reasons, visited only accepts basically color manipulation. And hover is styles applied when a user mouses on an element. So if you have a hover, let's see, is my GIF going to work? There we go. So that's when a user mouses over. Focus, there are styles applied when an element has received focus via either the keyboard or the mouse. Hello, folks. How goes? You'll notice that in the screenshot, there's also the blue border around. That's default for most browsers. You don't want to get rid of that outline because it's going to help with accessibility. You can usually put focus and hover on your same styles. Active is styles applied when a user activates an element. And so when interacting with the mouse, this is typically the time between the user presses the mouse button and releases it. And so it gives the user some sort of visual feedback. So you can hover over it, nothing, but then when you press on it, you get something. All right, so easy. So now let's get into some content. Language. This applies with a match of elements based on document language, and this could be on the HTML tag or on a specific div with your language element. So in this example, if we have language of EN for English and language for ES for Spanish, our language ing probably wouldn't be on every div, it would be on the root, but this is for an example. And then you can specify and call out specifically what those language pieces are. So this is good for if you're doing describing of other languages, or you have other languages in your content and you have to style things, or you have to change the font sizes, or indentations, or quote styles, etc. After an element matches virtual last child of the selected element. So if we have div after content, you're great, and our div says hello there, visually we're going to see there, hello, you're great. We don't really want to put text content into our CSS, though, so you're better off putting it in a data attribute, and then you can pull that into your content, just so you keep that separation. And what's also nice is you could use after on, say, external links, if you wanted an arrow or an icon to have people show to go off somewhere. So in this, it has to another site, and then our arrow, I'm out of here, blah, blah, blah. You can also use this for tooltips, icons, visual candy, or CSS gradients. And before matches a virtual first child of the selected element. So this is good for replacing list items, adding quotes, tooltips, icons. Excuse me, I'm just getting over a cold. So my voice is a bit out there. If you want to see an amazing use of after and before, check out A Single Div by Lynn Fisher and prepare to have your mind. First letter. Styles are applied to the first letter of that specific selector. So in this case, if we wanted to do a drop cap, or if we wanted to style the first letter for a drop cap, we can target it, and then it's going to give us that. I mean, you could style it much better, but this is demo purposes. And you can target that first letter. First line. Styles are applied to only the first line of an element. And so if you wanted to do your font variant of small caps to get some typography going, it's super easy to do now. And what's nice is this stuff's also responsive. So it takes into consideration whatever the screen is. So there's no more of wrapping a span inside a fixed div item. Selection. Styles applied to elements that have been highlighted with a mouse. And so we have our same paragraph. And we can highlight and change the color. When you change the color, you want to go through some accessibility contrast testing just to make sure that it works correctly for visually impaired users. And support is pretty much good with that. Negation. Not. So it's a negation pseudo class that accepts a simple selector as an argument. And what's nice, or what's interesting about not is it doesn't change the specificity in itself. It takes whatever you put as the argument and uses that specificity. So the actual not doesn't affect. And not will accept a CSS class, a pseudo-class, an ID, HTML element, an HTML attribute, but will not accept a CSS pseudo-element. So in this case, if we have list item not last child, it's going to style those first three items and not the last. The nice part about this is then you're only adding styles to these elements and you're not adding extra ones. You're not like adding this to the last one and then using a class of last or using last child to find it. And I should have mentioned this in the beginning. Throughout my slides, I've tried to style the pseudo-class I'm mentoring in the gold, and then in the example, what it affects also in gold, to help give a little bit of visual recognition for you. You can use not and after together. So going back to that previous example of an external URL with the arrow, if you didn't want to rely on a class or target blank, you could do some href attributes, and you can chain not together multiple times, and then after you can put the arrow. This gives you a specificity of 32 because you have 3 attributes and 2 HTML elements. So just remember that when you're using this stuff. Forms. Checked. So styles applied to radio checkbox option element that is checked to an on state. On state. So this could be useful for styling your labels, changing your labels, or giving additional visual feedback to any users. Disabled are styles applied to form elements that are disabled, and they are unable to accept focus or content input. So disabled is just an HTML attribute. The middle field is disabled. All right, and when you press tab to tab through, it skips that one. And a disabled field does not get submitted with the form. Read-only, however, is just not writable by user. So read-only is, again, an HTML attribute. And you can actually focus on a read-only field, and then when the form is submitted, that value will be submitted as well. And this could be helpful if you need to show some input and then turn the ability to edit on and off with some JavaScript or whatnot. Read-write styles applied when an element is writable by user. So this is basically an input that is neither read-only nor disabled. So it's your default inputs. Or it's a text area, which is neither read-only nor disabled, or a content editable. section. And content editable support is getting there. Valid. So styles applied to form elements with a value that validates according to our element settings. So these are your like HTML5 inputs. So you've got like email, URL, number, telephone, date. And the browser does a pretty good job like out of the box of validating it. If you'll notice though, before anything is full, it's technically valid, and then you start typing, and then it's valid, but there's no dot yet. So it's not 100% there, but it gets you a step closer to your validation. Support is pretty great. Invalid does the same thing, but it's when an element is invalid. So it gives you the type. And so like that's not a valid email, but it registers as a valid email. So again, you just want to use some caution. If you're only relying on this, which you can use the two of them together, and you can use, or rather, you can use them both, and you can actually use the negation not along with focus, so that instead of validating on every key up, you can just validate it when it blurs. Required, styles applied to form elements that have required attribute. You could probably get pretty tricky if you're using a preprocessor and be able to find like the parent item of that required and then target the label and add an asterisk or other fields. Or you could just use a class, which is going to make more sense. You could also put the label after and use a adjacent sibling and then use some flexbox to reorder it. But again, like what level of trickery do you want to maintain? Required validation, great. Optional, it's going to be your default inputs that don't have required. What's nice about this is that if you have a lot of required fields or only a few required fields, so you have a lot more optionals, you can style those a little bit differently if you need to, if you're trying to get different content, or if you're trying to increase conversion rates and you want people to get through those required fields. Indeterminate. So this is styles applied to a checkbox with a JavaScript. Styles applied to a checkbox, JavaScript-based, indeterminate state, or an empty progress bar. So what this means is if you have a list of checkboxes within, you can actually have this third state. So instead of on and off, there's a third one, indeterminate, where by clicking one of the children, you get the minus sign on the parent. In range. So this really only works on input type number. You might be better off using like input type range, but it's if the value is within your HTML attribute range. So you have input type number, min 5, max 10. If the number inputted is within that validates, great. If it's not, then you can use our next one. In range works except for old IE. They don't really care about it. Out of range, same thing, but out of range instead of in range. Placeholder, so these are styles applied to the placeholder content within the actual input. It's not actually shown in the spec yet, and it still has the vendor prefixes. Everyone treats it like an element except for IE. They still treat it like a class, so it gets that single colon. But this will style the text within the actual placeholder value. Placeholder shown, so these are the styles applied to the actual input, so the parent item of your placeholder. So if we have that same one, we can target the input. So if you want to target inputs that have placeholder shown, and it's a parent and it's a class, there is a nice article on CSS tricks from June that actually changed the invalid, not focus, not placeholder shown. So you can get around some of that awkward validation that the browser gives us. Unfortunately, support for it is still pretty crummy, but your Chrome, Safari, Opera hang out pretty well. All right, layout. First child. Styles applied when the element is the first child of an element. So in this one, if you are targeting your paragraphs, it's going to be that first paragraph. Welcome to the demo, leading paragraph. Last child is styles applied when the element is the last child. So Say you've got a div and you know the last paragraph is going to be some sort of legal or footnote copy. You can target that paragraph. This stuff is nice when you're working with CMS or maybe inside of an iframe where you can't manipulate the HTML or you can't add classes and you need to target specific elements. Being able to target them through this is pretty helpful. Only child is styles applied to any element that is the only child of its parent. You could also chain first and last child together. So if you had a layout where you had a couple stories and your only story in the section, you wanted it to be 100% width. Whoa. But along with first child, last child, only child, you have first of type. And so this is a little bit different in that if in first child, it only registers if that paragraph was that first descendant. If it's going to be the second one, you want to use first of type because then it will find that paragraph and style it correctly. If you used first child here, it wouldn't work because paragraph is not the first descendant child. Last of type, same thing. So it's going to pick that last element. So if you use last child, we have this anchor here, so it's not going to pick it up. So typically when you're using this stuff, you want to use either first of type or last of type rather than necessarily the child. Only of type, if you can guess what this does, it's when it's the only one of its type. So this, say, from the previous example, you wanted to toss in a caption. If you were using only child, it wouldn't register those classes, so it would break your layout. But this way, you're targeting div only of type, so you get that. And what's nice is you can also do negation on this. So if you want to style that is not the only of type, so if it's more than one, then you can style that way. Nth child. So this is a really powerful pseudo-class for layout and selection of items. So it's going to apply your styles based upon the source order. So in this, nth child 3, so we have our list of item, and then we've got the blocks of it showing. It's going to pick our third item. You can also do odd, and you can do even. You can also add in the n variable, and so the n value starts at 0 and basically increments up by 1, and then we use order of operations. So n equals 0, n equals 1, n equals 2. So if we have nth child 3n, the way it's going to count is 3 times 0 is 0, 3 times 1 is 3, 3 times 2 is 6, 3 times 3 is 9, etc., etc. And that's how it's going to break out and pick your elements. You can go even further than that, and you can add arithmetic to it. So 3n plus 2 is going to give us 2, 5, 8, 11, and the math on that is the same. So 3 times 0 is 0, plus 2 equals 2. 3 times 1 is 3, plus 2 is 5. 3 plus 2 is 6, plus 2 is 8, so on, so on, so on. Does that make sense? Cool. Cool. You can do subtraction. So 5n minus 3, 5 times n is 0, minus 3 doesn't count. 5 times n is 1, minus 3 is 2, etc., etc. You can also do it to start at a specific number and then count forward by just doing n. So 0 plus 5 is going to find that fifth element, 1 plus 5, 2 plus 5, 3 plus 5, etc. You can do it to count backwards. So this could be useful, the counting forwards and counting backwards could be useful if you have a big layout on a blog or whatnot, and you want your first X amount of posts to be styled in a certain way, and then your next amount of posts styled a certain way. And so this counts backward by -0 plus 4 is 4, -1 plus 4 is 3, da, 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 da. And you can do it with a range, so you can have one counter going forward and one counter counting backwards. So if you wanted your first set styled away, this middle set styled away, and a third set styled away, you can do it via this. If you wanted to, you could stick a whole range inside of it, or you could find it evens. And then there's also nth last child. So the previous nth child starts from the beginning, nth last child starts from the end. So in 3, it's not 7 minus 3, it counts. So it's 7, 6, 5. So that seems to hang a lot of people up. But you can count backwards from your last element. And so with this, you can start to do quantity queries. And so there's a nice article and a list apart about this. But basically, this example, our last child, 7. So if we count 7 back, and it's also our first child, we know that there's 7 elements. And so then we can use the sibling and select all those elements. So this could be nice, again, for your layout or for your nav if you're working on a CMS for a client and you know that the client's going to be adding content to the navigation and you want to be able to control how that will look within basically a minute max, you can do that. You can also check out a minimum amount. So nth last child, n plus 5, will tell you that there's a minimum of 5 elements, and then you could use that same sibling and target all of those. So if you wanted a specific layout when you have so many items, you could use it this way. Nth of type is just like our first child or our first of type, where it will do the source order and the element type rather than just the source order. And nth last of type is the same thing, where it will do the source order and not just, or source order of the element and the type and not just the source order. Target, so these are styles applied to the active element that is targeted with a fragment identifier. So I'm using display none. That's not really accessibility friendly, but again, this is just for a demo. So if you have an anchor for services and you have a div with ID services, then you can be able to click around and basically show hide content without using JavaScript. Root, so these are styles applied to the highest level parent element. So in an HTML document, it's typically going to be the HTML selector, but you could also use this in SVG or an XML doc. And this has a higher specificity than HTML because this is a class, so it has that 10 or 10, where HTML is an element, so it has that 1. So if you need to override it, you can do it with root. And empty. So styles are applied to elements that have no children or white space. White space and elements are considered to not be empty. Comments or no space within it is considered empty. So in this example, hello world is not empty. The divs that touch that have no white space are empty. That bottom example has space, so it's not considered empty. So you'd only be able to style that middle one. In the next version, CSS4, or not next version, but blank, will help us remove elements that are empty or have white space so that we can start to reduce that. Why is this one helpful? If you're working in a CMS or an application that gives you a lot of generated markup that you want to get rid of, or if you're on a site and your client has a lot of WYSIWYG control and you want to be able to maintain styles, you can hide a lot of this stuff. In the future, so hopefully these are coming soon. So there's scope and styles applied within the parent element of a scoped HTML. I guess you'll see this in some CMSs. But your style scoped, and then you can do either styles within that, or you can target that internal or inline style. Mozilla states selectors can be matched with an explicit set of scope elements. This is a set of elements provide reference point for selectors to match against, such as that specified by query selector in the DOM. Basic support for it is in Chrome, but it's coming. Has. So I thought this one was pretty neat. So it's a relational pseudo-class. So it would be like header has signed in so that you could show a different header to a client based upon if they're signed in or if they're a guest. You could already do this in CSS just with parent-child classes. So I assume that's why we're not going to get this. But I thought it was a neat spec. Not, so they're going to allow multiple selectors so that you don't have to chain a bunch of knots together. You can just list them within that one argument, just to make it a little bit cleaner. And then I saw this tweet by Gunnar, and I thought it was hilarious. So in dev mode, if a developer has put an ng click or a JavaScript click on anything that's not an anchor, not a button, not an input, or doesn't have tab index, it screams at them visually. So I thought that was nice. Matches takes an argument, selector list. So what this will do is it'll basically spit out matches from that first example into that bottom one. So this might be a nice way to keep your subclasses in different modules all linked up and styled correctly. Local link, so styles website internal links with the ability to style the specific depth of the link. So you'll be able, if you're in WordPress, you could have links going to your actual blog post styled differently than ones that go to specific archives. This could be nice for table of contents, or to display how deep information goes in large like tech or educational reference documents. You could also probably use it with the negation, so you can make that even simpler. Focus within is something that we are going to get, and so this styles elements that receive focus and their parent element, which I think is great for accessibility. So it'll be able to style the input and the wrapping div or list item on focus. And then some other ones, so column, drag and drop stuff, the current, past, future is video, and then some spelling and grammars. And that's it. So thanks for listening to me ramble.